I'm now pleased to introduce our panel on the importance of financing and investment and funding for waste and loss prevention. Our moderator is business expert Stephanie Strom, who most recently was the food business writer at the New York Times. She will be joined by Gigi Chang, the managing director of Food Future Company, Ron Gonen, the co-founder and CEO of Closed Loop Partners, Justin Kamine, a partner at KDC Ag Kamine Development Corporation, Tinia, Pina, the founder and CEO of Re-Nuble. I just butchered her name. It's Pina. It's not Pina. Alison Grantham, the director of Food Systems Research and Development at Blue Apron, and James Rogers, the science director and CEO at Apeel. So please join me in welcoming them all to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks. You too. No, I'm good. Okay, thanks. So hi, everybody. I guess I get the hot seat here. First, I just want to start by thanking Danielle and the sponsors for putting this together. It's never easy to put these things together, and she got a great crowd, a lot of great speakers, and we're all very thankful to her. So please, everybody, give a round of applause for Danny. So we have a great panel here today. I think that this panel kind of is a little different from what you've heard so far, because a lot of these people are working on food waste from before it becomes waste in your refrigerator, basically. They're looking for investments in food waste that will address the problem before it becomes a problem, and they're putting money into equipment and other things that address food waste. So we're looking at it a little differently. And I wanted to ask, any one of you can jump in at this time, kind of when you, maybe it would be interesting to hear from Justin or Ron about this, when you guys, or you Gigi, when you guys look at investments in food waste, how are you thinking of it? What does it mean for you? What are you looking at?
So we look at investments into food, and specifically the company that we first invested into 6 years ago, which was called California Safe Soil, of how do you get those technologies to a certain scale that could have true, meaningful, and impactful change over the next 5 or 10 years, not 20 or 50. Mm-hmm. So we really look at this, and our background is in large-scale infrastructure development. So we really look at how can we scale technologies to that infrastructure level to really move the needle that much quicker.
And so how big does that have to be when what is scale? What are we talking about in this arena?
So our commercial facility out in California currently digests 15 to 30 tons every 3 hours.
Oh, wow.
Using all those nutrients and that food waste that was on the shelves yesterday, and within that 3-hour process, we're able to put that directly into the soil or into an animal feed the very next day. So completely closing that agricultural cycle. We're now building a facility in Pennsylvania that will do about 100 tons every 3 hours.
Okay. And how did you raise the money for that?
So it's a large family development team. So we were primarily the funders of the technology when it first got started. Have brought in several partners, and now really scaling that technology nationwide. But we kind of took the emphasis that in order to have the greatest impact in the world, you also need to have the greatest economics for the supermarkets, for the business, and then for the farmers. So we're really completing that cycle.
Okay. Gigi, I think maybe you work on smaller scale things, right? Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think, similar to Justin, for us, we want to look at companies with a model that have impact. But I think there's also a question of adoption. So there's a lot happening in food waste that I think, it's just about timing, and adoption could eventually come. I think one area that's been really hot has been sort of like manufacturing byproducts, so alternative flours and reclaiming byproduct from manufacturing processes. Mm-hmm. But how those feed into the existing system is still a question mark, because you're asking people to substitute what they're already using, and you don't necessarily know if it's going to perform the same. So I think sometimes those are the challenges, and we want to support companies that are working toward better solutions, but then from an investment lens, you also want to make sure that ultimately the adoption is going to happen, because it doesn't matter if the idea is really great and the innovation is really great, but if you can't get people to adopt it in a bigger way and have that scale, it's really not going to have the impact.
What's an example of that problem, if you will? That is there like a byproduct? Is there a type of a grain that can't get into the food system, even though?
So for example, in the alternative flour space, if you guys have been looking at food waste, there's a lot that's happening there, and also in spent grains from beer production. So there's a lot of different models. One is taking that spent grain and making consumer products out of it, bars and cookies and things like that, which could be very interesting and might have some scale. But I think there's some education that needs to happen around that, and maybe consumers don't care that it comes from spent grain, and they just care that it's a really tasty bar or cookie. But ultimately, there's another company that's sort of taking, they did an analysis around what are some of the largest byproducts from certain manufacturing processes. So they identified soy as one example. And there's a wet product that comes from the production of tofu and soy milk. And so they're taking that product and making a flour from it. But rather than making like a consumer product, they're going after a B2B market. And I think that's really smart, because if you can convince a large food production company to switch out their flour, the impact and the scalability of that is going to happen much quicker than getting consumers to eat alternative cookies, for example.
Right, that's interesting.
Most of what we will look for is where's the economic pain point when someone's pitching us. So if you take a New York City, for instance, New York City spends about $180 million a year disposing of food waste in landfill. All right, $180 million a year. So what we're generally looking for are companies that could come into a New York City and say, for $160 million, we have a more sustainable way to handle your food waste. On the commercial side, if you look at a major grocery chain, 80% of their waste costs, whether it be the internal house operations or what they're paying the hauler, is related to food waste. That's most of what's coming out of a supermarket. So we're looking for companies that can develop a product, a solution, or a technology for supermarket chains that helps them reduce that cost in a more sustainable way. So it's always looking for where is the economic pain point in the supply chain, and how is your solution eliminating it.
And how much food waste actually comes from the supply chain side of things? Do you guys have any idea what the breakdown would be? I know most of it's on the consumer side, right?
It depends on if you're looking at the meat industry, and then within the meat industry, are we talking poultry, fish, beef? On the agricultural side, it depends on if you're looking at strawberries versus lettuce. That being said, there is a significant amount of food waste. We actually just invested in a company called Rebound Technologies that's a more advanced refrigeration technology, because a lot of the food waste on the agricultural side comes from spoilage. This food needs to travel long distances, and it oftentimes gets touched multiple times from going from truck to truck, facility to facility, across regions that have different temperatures, and the reality is some of it spoils. And there's a major economic opportunity for anyone that can figure out how to develop better refrigeration technology to reduce that food waste.
Yeah, I think that's
James, you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, no, I think it's the point is well taken, and the kind of numbers we look at, we work with growers and exporters are, 3 to 4% is being lost in transit, but the numbers are 3 to 4 times that at the retail level, and it's exactly to your point. If you look at how produce is transported around the world, you put all this energy into growing fresh produce, and farmers are taking care of their land, and then they're growing, they're packing the produce, and then they're putting it in a sealed box, a reefer container, and then they're shipping it across the world to wherever it's going to be imported. And during the transit period, you can precisely control the temperature, the humidity, the atmosphere of the produce when it's in those conditions. But when it arrives at the retail shelf, right, you lose those conditions, right? Retailers aren't having you go into the grocery store and put on a parka and go into the cold room and select your produce, right? It's sitting right out in front of you. It's an aesthetic purchase decision. And so it's when the food basically comes out of that box that you get massive increases in the amount of spoilage that's happening. And so and that is just a kind of a necessary consequence of the way that consumers like to experience and purchase their produce. And so advanced refrigeration technology is incredibly useful during the transportation phase. But if consumers are going to continue to interact with the produce the way that we do today, the way that we've been kind of shopping for and working with produce for the last 10,000 years, we have to find solutions that address not just the transport phase, but also now the retail phase of that produce, and also at home for the consumer. So what our company does is we're trying to use food waste to solve the food waste problem, which sounds really simple, but effectively what we do as a company is we take plant material, we take things that are unused or wasted or left behind. We blend those things up, and from those blends, we extract subsets of very particular food molecules. We turn these into powders, so they're lightweight, they're low cost for us to distribute. And then we ship them to where we'd like to use them, and that's to a grower's facility, generally right where the produce is being harvested and packed. We mix that powder back up with water, and then we dip fresh produce into that solution, and we allow it to dry. And when it dries, it leaves behind this imperceptibly thin barrier of plant material on the outside of the produce. And that thin barrier acts to physically slow down the rate that water evaporates out of the produce and the rate that oxygen gets into the produce. And by doing that, we're able to dramatically extend the shelf life of most types of fruits and vegetables, even without the use of refrigeration. And of course, the technology works in conjunction with refrigeration during the transport period. But now, when the produce is sitting on the retail shelf or sitting at home on your counter, you get the additional benefit of an improved shelf life of that produce, even when the produce is not sitting in the refrigerator.
And are people, retailers or producers really interested in this? What are you seeing?
There's a ton of excitement about this, and the reason I think the excitement is that most of the solutions today have been very focused on the transport period of the produce. We have controlled atmosphere shipping, as discussed, we have refrigeration, we're using high humidity storage. All of these are kind of solving the key things that cause produce to spoil, which are the water loss and the oxidation, basically, of the produce. But the way that the system is set up, you've got growers, a bunch of disaggregated growers all around the planet, and they are aggregating their produce into a central location like a packing house. And the packing house is basically responsible for sizing and grading the fruit. What's the grade A, what's grade B, what size boxes is it going into, where's it going? And then it's getting transported or imported into wherever it's going to go. And then when the produce is received by the retailer or the importer, they open up that shipping container, they look at the produce, there's a quality inspection which occurs, and if the fruit looks good at that point, check, and then the grower is being paid. And now the retailer basically owns that product. And so any loss that then occurs at the retail level is the responsibility or affects the bottom line basically of that retailer. And so because most of these solutions have been focused on the transport phase, retailers now are very excited about the ability to have a piece of produce which is going to last longer on their shelves and as a result have less shrink. And so we found an incredible reception by working with both growers and retailers in order to create high quality produce that remains high quality not just during transport but also at retail and then ultimately at home for the consumer.
Interesting. What are the opportunities for investment in food waste? I mean, we've all heard about, the companies you were talking about where they take an ugly fruit or an ugly veggie and they make it into some other delicious product. But beyond that, do you all find enough to invest in? Are there lots of opportunities? Yeah? Okay.
No, go for it.
I'd say speaking as a fund manager, the challenge isn't the opportunities or the number of companies out there. It ranges from the solution we just heard, which is an incredibly innovative solution, all the way to large-scale digesters. The challenge is the entities that generally invest in funds, whether they be family offices, high net worth individuals, investment banks, pension funds, they don't understand the space well enough to feel comfortable yet putting large sums of money in, and that's really the friction point. So, for instance, the number I heard of, spoilage is about 3%. Someone might walk away and go, it doesn't sound like a big number.
Right.
But it's 3% of what? It's 3% of tens of billions of dollars, annually.
Right.
And so that's a little bit of a friction point that exists today. I think that was the purpose of the ReFed study that was done a couple of years ago, and kind of why we're all sitting around here today was to make folks in the financial system aware of there's a lot of economic pain here because this isn't being managed well, and folks that can figure out how to eliminate that economic pain have an opportunity to do well by the environment and their investors.
I think there's an interesting correlation, in kind of talking about this with groups, in that if you look at some of the most successful companies, in our era right now, it's utilizing resources that were not being optimally utilized. So I think a great example is, Uber or Lyft, right? You had a bunch of spare seats in a car that was basically just sitting in a driveway, not being utilized. And by using technology, you were able to connect passengers who wanted to use those spare seats and look at the economic value that these businesses created. I think Airbnb is another great example. You had a bunch of homes that were sitting vacant when people were on vacation, for example, and look at how Airbnb has done by being able to use technology again to utilize more efficiently a resource that already exists. I think food waste is exactly that. We're underutilizing a resource that we have, and there are ways that we can use technology to start to unlock some of that wasted value through improved efficiency.
I would agree. I think we're finding ways to utilize those resources in a more efficient manner and kind of create more of that closed loop agricultural system. But also, the people are now desiring, consumers are now wanting a more open and transparent supply chain. They care about how their food is grown, where their food is grown, what is encompassing. I mean, Cargill just came out, which is mind-blowing to think that Cargill came out with a report that said that 43% of Americans actually care about what is fed to their animals, and that actually affects their buying decision as to what type of meat that they then consume. So you're seeing this monumental shift of people caring about their supply chain and caring about where and how their food is grown, which I think is driving this whole kind of conversation that we're having today.
And I want to say something too, but I want to let you say something first.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just thinking about the potential value in this space. At the macro level, we have $4 trillion in food revenue every year. That's like the market size, and we know that about 30 to 40% of that is wasted. So that's 1.2, 1.4 trillion dollars, and that trickles
with a T, not a B or an M.
And so we think about investment, but that's a huge cost-saving opportunity, and the companies that are bearing the brunt of the expense really have a strong motivator. That's if you could cut 30% of your expenses, you have a good reason to invest even internally.
So Tinia, I'm going to let, go ahead. I want to ask, so Alison, how does Blue Apron deal with its food waste issue? How do you minimize food waste at Blue Apron?
Yeah, so we fit into the picture nicely because in the US, in the developed world, most of that food waste is happening at the consumer side. And our model pre-portions the food and puts it in a format so that it is much easier for the consumer to actually cook and eat that food in a sitting, so they're
And use all of it.
and use
right?
all of it.
Yeah.
And so that helps in one way, but then it's also helping the handling the process of the food upstream. So the food is never sitting out at 68
Right.
degrees in a grocery store. We have specialized coolers with the correct humidity, temperature, ethylene conditions for storing each of our types of produce. And so it goes directly from the grower to our facility to the consumer, and doesn't have the exposure that the traditional retail supply chain has.
And within, on the back end of Blue End, what do you do to minimize?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that Blue Apron is doing. So right now we're partnering with Anthesis, doing a supplier side food waste study. So identifying where are the streams that are being underutilized on the supplier side. So our direct dialogue with producers allows us to go in and say, okay, where's the fraction of your harvest that you're not utilizing? And so what we're looking at right now is the small sizes. Grocery stores love those jumbo peppers. We love the small peppers that may have just been left in the field previously. Same thing with like sweet potatoes. The traditional environment, retail environment, people will think they want like that big looks bountiful, but reframing desirability to be small, cute, and what fits, in a consumer's stomach in a given meal is the ultimate way to. It's all about source reduction, right? The food waste hierarchy, reducing the source, and that's what we help consumers do.
That's cool. Tinia?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you were asking about where is there new ideas for new innovation within the food supply chain, and I think one area is definitely direct to farm service, so composting at those sites and definitely providing, whether it's a service or a product that can take a homogenized crop stream and really reclaim and optimize as much value from just that single, let's say, potato waste stream or single tomato waste stream and turn that into a value-added product has a lot of value because, we work at Re-Nuble, we take wholesale produce, distributed produce waste, as well as food waste from other suppliers, and we turn that into both dry and liquid nutrients for both the hydroponic and soil-based cultivation. But if someone can really crack the nut and reclaim as much value from just a single food waste stream, that has a lot of value to it. Our model is a bit more distributed than others. We aren't invested in large infrastructure facilities. We operate both on-site from the food waste generators as well as off-site. So we have flexibility there, but I hope that gives an idea of some.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the most interesting things that I've seen dealing with food waste in the last, say, year or so was the Italian government funded a project with tomato peel to create, like, instead of BPA on the inside of your can, you'd have like a lining made from the excess tomato peels, which is kind of an example of what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Well, that also reminds me of something else I wanted to ask you guys about. How much money is available from the public side of things, from like the federal government or government? The EU funded that project, for instance. Is there money available in the public sphere?
So that's something we've always struggled, and I guess I'll go ahead and lead on this. So we're bootstrapped. We raised a little bit of institutional money during our pre-seed round, and now we're going out and seeking seed funding now, but we've been very lean and very flexible and responsive to the types of products we make because we're operating at a small scale, and I think that's been an advantage for us. In terms of federal or public funding, there are some grants and nonprofits that do kind of fund this in a non-dilutive way. But federally, when we went out and tried to create what would be a closed loop operating system for hydroponic greenhouses, and we would say, okay, for the produce waste that would be generated at these sites, could we then take that, turn into a product on site and have a true recirculated closed loop system? They didn't take an interest in that grant. So they're very specific, very niche almost, and I think given the current administration, there's been a reduction in 30% of funding in that route. It's been significantly challenging.
Yeah.
I'd say it's available, but it's expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean it's expensive in terms of time. You hear non-dilutive capital and you think, oh, that's great, let's go do that. But it's a 4-year, it's a four-year due diligence process, and then it's a marginal amount of money, and by then the opportunity may have passed you by. So I actually think the most valuable thing that the government can do is provide technical validation that a concept could be feasible, and even a marginal grant that came from a respected organization with a short lead cycle means a ton to potential investors who may not be super savvy in the science of that space, but are ready to jump in if there's some level of technical validation by an outside party, because we find that there is capital in the system. It's just a matter of if you're offering a scientific solution and the capital isn't able to validate that technology, they need external validation before they're ready to come in and really push that across the finish line. So from my perspective, again, it's available, but it's just very expensive in terms of time. There's a major opportunity cost.
Okay. Am I looking at the clock wrong? No. Go ahead.
Do you have a comment?
Please.
I was going to say also that I think in the public funding space, it's very fragmented because the way that the funding happens is really dependent on categories and labels. So I don't know that there's organizations necessarily that are saying we're funding food waste. So it really depends on your business model and really what it is that you're addressing. So, one of the companies in our Food Future Co portfolio, their solution has multiple kind of touch points in terms of mission, and food waste is certainly one of them. They're a local company in North Carolina. They work directly with small farmers, helping them to kind of mitigate potential loss by contracting to freeze some of their harvest. And then they have a consumer brand, and they have other aspects in terms of the way that they go to market with their price parity, and so they're able to be in like a Piggly Wiggly as well as a Whole Foods. So they're also giving access. So they have a lot of kind of legs to their model, and because of the way that they're working with local farmers, they've been able actually to get some agricultural grants from their county. About a third of their funds raised to date have come from that, so that's fantastic because it is non-dilutive. And but it's under an agricultural grant, and it's because they're working at the county level. And food waste is an aspect of their mission, but it's not like a food waste grant. So I think if people are working in these models around food waste, but they're trying to get grants, try to think about what are the levers of your model that would fit into the predefined buckets, and then how you might get a grant from that lens as opposed to the food waste lens.
Would climate change funders fund food waste?
Potentially,
Right.
yeah.
They should.
Right.
They should, right?
Yeah, right.
That's actually a space where we have been that sort of intersection with agriculture. So conservation innovation grants are available for producers, and we have we put one in the state, and that's the issue there, like regional or the conservation innovation grants have both state competitions and national, but partnering with our regional supply network in Pennsylvania on a key like pre-harvest loss issue, a pest management issue, to reduce that issue and get funding to do that through the conservation innovation grants. So that's a real upstream food loss solution, where there's some public funding.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, please.
I think where a government can have the most impact is by being the biggest customer for these services. Government is the largest consumer in North America. I'll give you a few examples. New York City public schools are the second largest food service provider in North America. The first is the US military. So when New York City decided to start focusing on an organics program and diverting organics from the landfill stream, where we focused first was on the New York City public school system. Number one, because there's lots of food waste in the system, second largest food service provider in North America. But number two is, as we would begin to deploy an organics program across the city, you would have all of these kids that had learned how to do it in their school. Well, in order for the school districts in New York to be able to comply, they had to get rid of their styrofoam trays, which meant they went looking for compostable trays. And all of a sudden, exploded the market for compostable trays. Another example is when a city says we're going completely organic in terms of our curbside organics program, or does a commercial food waste ban, it creates massive opportunity for compost facilities, anaerobic digester companies, because these are the companies that are going to need to process that. So I always think it's great if government can provide grants and loans. That's phenomenal. But I think we should always look to government to actually become the biggest customer for these services, which then creates an incentive for investors to come in and fund those companies that can service government.
Yeah. I think too that we also need to be aware of the negative externalities of what the government can do. I mean, Paul Pearson from the World Wildlife Foundation was just up here talking about 80% of the U.S. agricultural land or production goes to feeding animals. Well, we as U.S. taxpayers subsidize corn and soy, which then inherently is fed to animals because it's super cheap. Yet that's not their efficient maximum diet that they're typically used to growing on. So there is that cyclical cycle. A company like ours, which is Katie's Yag, we're creating a animal feed pelletized product from food waste within that 3-hour process. So essentially we patented the human digestion process and creating that nutriently dense pellet. We're now selling that as a conventional feed price product. So giving a natural hedge or just a natural product that is the efficient diet of an animal and a non-corn and soy based product.
So does it go into a feed store just like a bag of corn would? Or
exactly. So we've kind of figured this whole thing out on a large scale infrastructure where we take in meats, fruits, vegetables, and baked goods. Within 3 hours, we grind it up very similar to your teeth, use digestive enzymes very similar to your stomach. Then that product is fully pasteurized and blended very similar to a wine for consistency, so that the very next day I can pelletize that product and give to a farmer the exact nutrient profile that animal needs in the exact form, and give it to them in a way that can fit into their current business practices, which is typically a pelletized form. So I'm now giving it to them at a price competitive conventional feed against corn and soy, but giving them a more sustainable. So there is some negative externalities with the government funding that and how that all kind of comes together.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has to be a market solution. We can't just, ask people to do the right thing. Everyone says they want to, and then, it doesn't happen.
Well, is that part of the issue with food waste, is that given that such a big portion of it comes out of my refrigerator, right? That we're not dealing, that we're sort of wringing our hands over something and expecting the consumer to do something about it, but we really need to be doing it upstream from that. Before it ever gets to the consumer, we need to solve the problem for them. Is that kind of what you all are saying?
I think dealing with upstream, the challenges are far less because you're not at risk of contamination. You can deal with sometimes a homogenized waste stream. There's more predictability from a food waste processor or value-added manufacturer. There's more predictability in our quality product control. Working downstream, we almost are discouraged to even get into sourcing from that, because even though the diversity of dealing with food waste brings a lot of plant benefits to it, and there's a lot of interesting microbial synergies that happen when you have a diversified food waste stream, it's just, we're going for the low-hanging fruit, and working upstream allows us to do that.
I think there's such a and something that Tom Colicchio said this morning, there's such a disconnect between the consumers and who's actually producing. I read some stat recently that 1 in 6 people in the U.S. now have never seen a cow. So there's just a disconnect between the farming and what we're actually eating.
Pig is even more rare, right? Nobody ever sees a pig outside anymore. So I've had a lot of fun asking these folks questions. Now I want you to help me out. So back there.
Hi, Ed Dudley with Griffith Foods. We're a B2B ingredient manufacturer. We supply food ingredients to other companies, and we're working in the waste stream area to try to convert industrial waste streams into functional ingredients that other food companies that can then use. And one of the challenges we're finding is that when we go to our customers with a product that's produced from a waste stream, oftentimes, at least right now, it's not at cost parity to another ingredient that they would then want to take out. And both ingredients may be clean label, right? So from a consumer perspective, if they can't pass that cost along, they're like, why should I do this? So I guess the question for the panel is, do food ingredient manufacturers like myself have to just find a way to do it at cost parity? Or are we going to be able to get consumers to not just care, but care about and show it by their ability to, maybe invest a little bit more in products that are made with waste stream materials?
I can speak to your question. It's a great question. On the agriculture side, right, we also deal with farmers really want to do what's responsive to what their consumers want, and they want the most sustainable best practice. But at the end of the day, they have to make sure that ultimately their costs don't exceed and doesn't dissuade them from achieving that performance, that yield. So if it were me, I would prioritize cost parity first, because trying to convince and educate the consumer that this is the right type of ingredient because of our process and because of our mission, it's going to be more expensive than to do the otherwise.
And there's some niche ponds that you can live in where the consumer is already demonstrated a willingness to pay a premium. Organic is a great example. Sometimes fair trade is a great example. The other thing to explore is, where else could these ingredients be used where you're not fighting a commodity price battle? Are there specialty ingredient markets that you could be in? Are there other components of what you're doing that may be more valuable in a different market?
Hi, I'm Allie Forsman. I have a company called Cultivate NY, which is a large-scale composting on-site for farms and brownfields. And my question is mainly for Ron, but obviously anybody. We are effectively a blue-collar company. We're bringing in large-scale waste from New York City and putting it on farms and brownfields and creating green spaces and restored soil. The balance of finding an investor who sees that within a year or two you're profitable versus these sort of short-term business opportunities in the waste space, like compostable trays and utensils, which I can tell you firsthand is a mammoth good idea gone bad. Nobody wants to deal with these things. Nobody. There's a space that can be dealt with. But ultimately, how do investors, or how do you look at your companies that you say, okay, there's a long-term vista on this. This problem isn't going to go away, but there's a food cycle issue, and there's also just the mechanization of it that has to be dealt with.
From a company perspective, one of the important things to show is that you're able to get the feedstock over a long period of time, right? So one of the challenges in this space is someone will say, I have this great technology that can process food waste. And the first question is, well, how much material do you need as feedstock in order to hit your numbers? And they'll say a number, and they'll say, well, where do you expect to get that food waste from? You're either going to get it from businesses or you're going to get it from the city. Have you been able to get a long-term contract with them? So that's one thing we look at. And then we look at the issues related to actually permitting the facility, which is also complicated and takes time.
We need one, by the way.
Pardon?
We figured out a way to do it without a permit.
Yeah. So, but that's that's good.
Can't be in regulation, by the way.
Right. No. So that's good. But I would say you need to be able to demonstrate that you can do the facility. But I would say that the biggest obstacle is demonstrating that you're able to get that food waste over long periods of time. Because you could say that, hey, today I'm able to take this food waste because there's no other place for it to go. The challenge as investors, you're going to look around and say, but is someone going to come up with a solution 2 years from now or 3 years from now that can take that food waste for less money, in which case your facility shuts down? And that's always the challenging part, is how do you get that long-term contract for that feedstock? Does that answer your question?
Anyone else?
Sorry, I can't.
Lucyna Kurtyka with the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. My question is for James, actually. You developed an innovative product from a food waste from plants, and I wanted to ask you whether you had to go through any regulatory approval and the implications of that for from the cost and time and everything else.
No, it's absolutely right. So food is one of those areas where it's not the Wild West. There are very strict regulations that you need to follow that touch organizations from the USDA to the EPA to the FDA. And that's just domestically within the United States, not to mention.
And also in California, right?
And then there's the California, and there's the California EPA, of course. And so I think of these things. So first of all, these things are important, right? Because at the same time, they can be challenging when you're going, well, this is great. Everyone should think this is wonderful. They can be a partner in many ways because they, having gone through their processes. Then you're able to put kind of their stamp of approval or whatever that you've done, and so they're actually a partner in some ways. The comment I'll make is that what I do think it does, and I don't know the solution to this, is it creates a pretty intense barrier to entry if you want to create a new product in the space. Because, for example, you want to make and test a product with a customer. Just to be able to do that, you have to develop what's called current good manufacturing practices, which involve, and that's just to do the manufacturing. That's not even to get the product approved for use. And the overhead that creates for a small company, if you're trying to iterate quickly and try new things, is incredibly arduous. And so I see often that people will have ideas and they'll need to go partner or kind of sell the technology to a big company that offers you, we'll take care of all that overhead for you, but now you're just kind of licensing the technology to them, and you're no longer able to execute on your vision for what you think that could be because you weren't able to get through that by yourself. And so we were fortunate to raise enough capital to be able to build those capabilities within our organization. And now once you figure out what the processes are, you get them installed, you have document management, you're fully in compliance. Now the rate that you're able to iterate is much more quickly, but figuring those things out for the first time, takes years and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you're a small company, you might go raise $100,000 and then go, oh, well, now I need to give this to this attorney to help me figure out for the first time how to go through this process. And so, I've been, kind of encouraging teams on we have a full regulatory team now. We have probably 10 people on our regulatory team of a company of 85 people. Kind of encouraging them to, let's write this stuff down. Let's help other people, realize what's involved in getting into the food space. But it's important. It's very important for consumer safety. But it also is an impediment to innovation in the space. And I think that kind of people who've gone through it are able to really share their story, and that's very helpful. But finding those beachheads, finding those people to even talk to are incredibly challenging. So I think events like this are really important in just being able to get the information concisely and not have to pay an attorney for 50 hours of work to just tell you who to talk to.
So, back there.
I'll try to speak loudly. Hi, my name is Michael. I write for Forbes about the future of food. And hi there. And I was wondering, in the context of food waste, we talk about technology like James's company, which is doing incredible things, and KDC and the funding that's happening with your company. And I wonder where the conversation around consumer behavior and emphasizing more plant-based solutions, because the inefficiency of animal production, as Justin mentioned, where you put a unit of food into an animal, you get a third of it out, and 2/3 goes up effectively in manure and methane. How much of that part of the equation can we start to focus on, either within your businesses or just as a food waste issue altogether, to address that, because that seems, you don't need increased yields, you don't need technology, we just got to think about eating differently, and that could save boatloads of food waste every year. I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
You want to tackle that?
I love the solution of plant-based, and Memphis Meat and all these guys are trying to potentially grow their burgers inside of a lab. I'm also a realist of saying, okay, we slaughtered 125 million pigs last year in the US alone. China slaughtered 700 million pigs. We killed in the US 4 billion chickens. There's a huge, massive market that we need to make more environmentally sensible now. And then in the future, as these technologies start to grow and develop, whether it be Memphis Meats or vegan-based proteins, and as a society starts to kind of realize that opportunity to go vegan, I think we see that monumental shift. But in the next 10 years or so, those pigs and chickens are still going to be a huge component of our diet. And what we're focused on is how do we make that system much more environmentally sensible and sensitive now, and then hopefully in the future we can all as a society grow and become more in closed loop. And
I think it's cultural too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the meats that we're eating in the United States, it's a specific subset of those meats. And you go to other cultures, now goat is involved, right? And I think if we can early on, and I don't think all hope is lost in where we're already doing these things, but I think if we can focus on developing nations, people who are about to jump on to the higher GDP equals higher meat consumption curve, and we can introduce some of those plant-based options there, that's where I think we're going to get the most marginal utility for what we're investing. And then we're going to have to do the slow grind of cultural education within this country and other developed nations. But I think there's a big opportunity to get ahead of that in some of these developing nations.
Yeah, but it's also not about offloading the responsibility of developed countries.
I just think it's slower. No, of course, it's just slower.
Yeah.
It's a cultural change. And those just take time.
Yeah. And so I think, again, this is a place where a consumer-facing company like Blue Apron can play a role, and 1/3 of the recipes that we offer each week are vegetarian. So it makes it much easier for our customers to be part-time vegetarians, which is exciting because those vegetarian recipes have really cool specialty ingredients. They have lentils that were grown by a regenerative cooperative in Montana. And these are the things that you can make that cultural shift exciting and interesting and something that the developed world can also engage with.
And also add on, so we were approached by a vegan fund that had the mandate to only invest in, products that were plant-based and vegan. And with food waste, it's really hard to achieve that, and there's a research gap right now in terms of how to really optimally allow for just food waste alone, no supplements with cottonseed or blood meal that really provides that phosphorus and nitrogen to serve the true plant's needs. And that's something that we're really passionate about, is how can we really take food waste to the next level. It's something that we're trying to reinvest in and do our own internal research, but to have a product right now, I haven't seen the research right there to validate it.
It's interesting. From our perspective, and we talked originally about kind of infrastructure. Oh, sorry.
No, finish your thought, and then that's it.
Yeah, everyone's hungry. So from our perspective, when we talked originally about kind of large-scale infrastructure, which is what we look at and what we develop as a family, we kind of always come to the notion that, okay, we want to build 50 of our facilities across the U.S., which would completely eliminate all 3 million tons from supermarket from their food waste. If we put that all into pig feed, we only grow 20 million pigs. So out of the 125 million pigs, soon to be 135 this year, that's still a small fraction. So there's still a huge opportunity for us all to kind of continue to drive innovation and more sustainable practices.
So, thank you all very much for listening. Thank you all very much for talking. And Danielle, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just stand for your photo.